The FBI is offering a $50,000 reward for information on that pipe bomb suspect. Dozens of people have been arrested and charged for their roles in Wednesday's riot, and companies are taking action as well, firing employees identified in pictures and videos that are surfacing on social media, including one Maryland man who wore his work badge during the riots.
Joining us now, former Assistant U.S. Attorney David Weinstein. He's now with the Hinshaw law firm. David, thank you so much for being with us this evening. A lot of cameras captured the faces of the rioters who stormed the Capitol, many of them not wearing masks at the time. So does it surprise you that only a few dozen have been located and arrested at this point?
It doesn't really surprise me, Lauren. I think that what needs to happen now is they grabbed the people and arrested the people they could at the time that they were there. They're continuing their investigation, not only of the people who haven't been arrested, but of some of the individuals who have been arrested as well. One of the individuals had a number of Molotov cocktails within his vehicle. They're examining those to determine what additional charges will be filed. And for those people who they have photos of, as you said, they're enlisting the help of the public to try and identify those. Moreover, it appears from taking a look at some of the affidavits that were filed, there's a larger conspiracy at play here. And so there may be other individuals who help to incite and promote this riot and insurrection who will be charged at a later date.
Yeah, a lot of questions, David. Lauren and I were looking at some of the video where you see the police were just standing by as people went into the Capitol, and one guy identified himself as a member of the press, and he was told, oh, no, you can't go in. Yet they were letting crowds go in. So a lot of questions here. Let's talk about the penalties that they've faced. What's the severity of these penalties?
Well, they range from anywhere for 6 months for what we would call the trespass, entering into the building without permission, all the way up to 10 years and potentially even longer, depending upon whether the charges are filed. Certainly for those individuals who were armed when they walked in there, they're looking at from 5 to 10 years. The gentleman who had the Molotov cocktails and preparations for them in his car, he's looking at 20 to 40 years. The reality is their recommended guideline sentences are going to be a lot lower than that, but these people are looking at being detained and doing some serious time.
So there's a timeline that's emerging about when the president addressed the crowd, what was said, and then when the attack actually happened. 5 people now dead. Does the president have legal exposure here?
Well, he does to some extent, and the biggest question is going to be to prove the intent. Did the words that he say, were they intended to cause these people to simply go down and express their opinion and engage in free speech? Or were the words that he said intended to incite them to commit the violations that they've been charged with? It's a very thin line that's being looked at and walked on here. And certainly there's an argument that can be made when he told them to march down the street and I'm going to join with you and stop what's going on, that was intended for them to breach the facility and to stop the process, which are crimes that these people are being charged with. On the other hand, an argument can be made that he was simply telling them to go down and voice their opinion, or at least that's the argument those who are going to defend him would be making. Keep in mind, these are all federal crimes for which, if he wasn't the president, he could be pardoned, and for which, while he is the president, he can pardon all of these people.
Well, let's stay tuned for that possibility. David, President Trump will be out of office in, what, 12 days. Will he maintain legal protections because he was president of the United States?
Only until the day he leaves office. And the protections that he maintains while he's there are not necessarily completely bulletproof, because he maintains those protections while he's there, while he's in office. And that's because the Department of Justice has a policy that says we don't go forward and indict a sitting president. Once he leaves office, unless it was an act that he carried out in furtherance of his duties as the president, and none of these were, he loses that protection. And if he's not pardoned before he leaves, it would be up to the sitting president to pardon him after he's left.
So let's see what happens in the next 12 days. David Weinstein from the Hinshaw Law Firm, thank you for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Good to see you, Elliot. Good to see you, Lauren.
Good to see you too, David. CBS 4 News at 7. We'll be right back.